שמך מעשה אצבעותיך ירח וכוכבים אשר כוננת כי ירא שמך מעשה אצבעותיך ירח וכוכבים אשר כוננת מה אנוש כי תזכרנו ובן אדם כי תפקדנו ובן אדם כי תפקדנו מה אנוש כי תזכרנו ובן אדם כי תפקדנו ובן אדם כי תפקדנו ותחסרהו מיד מלוהים והדר לבשת ותחסרהו מיד מלוהים והדר לבשת מה אנוש כי תזכרנו בן אדם כי תפקדנו ובן אדם כי תפקדנו. When I look at your heavens, the sun and the moon whom you have established, I look at myself and ask, what is a weak human being that you should be mindful of him? A son of the earth that you should be aware of him. And yet, you made us just a little less than divine and dressed us, clothed us in glory and splendor. And from this awareness of glory and splendor, we go right back to look at the heavens and the vastness and the time and where we are. And all this is the space in which davening takes place. So I want to talk to you now about Davvenology. Just first I want to say that has been my long-standing concern, whether it was in the first edition of the first step or later on in a first step at in the first volume of the Chavurah book, the Jewish catalog, and since that time in Gate to the Heart. So I hope you have an opportunity to study these things. And yet, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the history and the work of Davvenology so that you might understand it. I want to tell you that not everything about Davvenology I learned from Judaism. First, as I began in Judaism, it was for me a situation where I wanted to compare it what other people had to say. I remember way back when I was still teaching at Lubavitcher Yeshiva in New Haven that I came across a little book called Difficulties in Mental Prayer by Father Eugene Boylan. And here was a Trappist monk who was describing things that are happening in audible prayer that is happening just as we did in Hitbonenut, in meditation. So there are things I learned from yoga, there are things that I learned from the Sufis. All this I bring to Davvenology because I believe that there is an aspect to Davvenology which is empirical. That is to say, it becomes transformative. When we do it the way in which it needs to be done, it shows itself in our lives. The wonderful Psalm 19 has Torah Hashem Temima Meshivat Nafesh. The Torah of God is perfect. Why? Because it restores the soul. And so I've gotten to read this backwards and saying that which restores the soul and gets it to grow, that is Torah. Edut Adonai ne'emana machkimat peti. What are the witnesses of God? They are the things that make a fool smart. So I see that whatever it is that we learn that makes a fool smart, that's divine witness. So as you see, it's from there, from that empirical quality, that when it is added to what we learn from Kabbalah and from the Siddur and from our tradition, gives us a whole and complete, remarkable system that is on level of sophistication, I think, at least as great as Patanjali's and all the others that are there. Because we've been working at this for a long time. We are good at davening. When people ask me about meditation and they think it was imported from the Far East, I keep pointing out that Psalm 19 ends with, "May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight." So it is prayer that is very important. And prayer for us doesn't mean just a kind of worship thing. It means really sometimes even arguing with God, as Abraham shows us. Are you going to destroy Sodom? Because it was a real personal communication. Now, what were some of the sources besides Judaism and other religions? Psychology. We learn a lot from psychology. And when Freud did us the favor of showing us that there's such a thing as the unconscious and there's psychodynamics, that too was so close in some ways to what we found in Chabad about the description of the Nefesh Elokid, the Nefesh HaSichlid, the Nefesh HaBahamid, and how they interact with each other and the dynamic that is there. Meditation craft. There's something remarkable that one can learn about how one steers consciousness. Most of us have a field of consciousness that shifts like the weather in Boulder. And things come in and go out, and we don't have a sense of being able to steer it. But now, for instance, when I'm talking with you, I really need to stay on course. And if I can do this, staying on course, when I'm talking with you, I can do this staying on course when I am in the presence of God. And that staying on course is a kind of meditation that they've called discursive meditation, which differs from contemplation, but that has time to be talked about. I learned a great deal of about that from Christians and from Catholics in particular. Now, psychedelics had helped in a fantastic way, because if you have had the experience, even if you read Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, you have a sense of the magic theater that's going on within a person, and what one can see and hear and know of oneself in there is amazing. So that has been in some way a fulcrum that has taken us out of the ego awareness into other levels of awareness. And once that has happened for people, whether it is through one means or another, it can be done through breath, it can be done through yoga, it can be done in so many ways. It can be done also by a simple recital of Psalms in the presence of God. And there's this breakthrough that happens. And the world looks different. Then there are the ecumenical things that I will describe in another lecture. Now, from the inside, I grew up in Vienna, and that was a remarkable place to be at, because I would go sometimes to the Seitenstätten Temple, the Pornischen Temple, which was the place where there was very ornate services that were done with high ritual, with cantor and choir. And in fact, I sang in one of those choirs, and I'm still proud today of the solos that I had in that choir. At any rate, there was something there that was Apollonian, that filled the space with the music and the harmony that we made, and it was a great, great payon to God. On the other hand, I went with Papa to daven in a shtibel where there were all kinds of rebellious Hasidim who loved to daven with each other, and on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, there was such a sound, such a screaming out, it was amazing. So, yes, that was there too. And there was also the impact that Catholicism had on me in its music with Gregorian chant and the smell of incense and so on. When I was a kid, I used to think that since I peeked into a church and seen women with babushkas and doing things with candles, I was convinced that all women are Catholic and all men are Jews, because when I went with Papa to daven, that's the way it was. So I learned something from that, and that also had some bearing on it. Now, when I fled Austria and came to Belgium, and I met this remarkable group of people who were Chabad Hasidim and who just opened up my heart and took me in. And there, when I went to daven with them, and I learned to chant differently than I had chanted before, and the thing of placing oneself in the presence of God was really strongly practiced there. And everything that I learned was immediately integrated into my inner landscape. So the things that came from Hasidism and from our tradition were very important, but also the nigunim that I learned. A whole range of beautiful melodies. So that was another part. And of course, when I came later on to Marseille, where I met the person who was then to become Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, there too was a place of davening in which I learned important things. Coming to the United States and davening in Lubavitch and learning about this amazing sense of davening ba'arichus, taking time with davening, so that one could, as it were, slowly chew on some of the words that one was saying, and take time to picture them inside of oneself. That was remarkable. And discovering the delight that there was in davening, that there was let me say, the coziness with God experienced that time. Davening late at night in the shul in Borough Park. We used to live on the third floor of the same building where the shul was. And in that solitude, breaking through all those things that seem to divide us from the presence of God and being and encountering there, that was a very important thing. I also loved to be with the Baba Hasidim, with their melody, with their form of davening, and watching the Baba Rebbe Zichron Levrocha at the Shabbos table. How remarkable that was to have a sense of both my Rebbe and the Baba Rebbe as kind of cosmic high priests, that what was happening when they were leading services was reconciling our life here on the planet with the divine plan. And then seeing Sephardim and their kind of davening, whereas Ashkenazim daven, there's this sound coming from all sides, and it's almost like chaotic. This is how David Wolf Blank used to call it, chaotic davening, says, get out of step. But when you daven with the Sephardim, they're in step. And it keeps on going with that rhythm, and you can't help but be entrained with what the community is doing. So I learned something from them. And I learned from other Eidot, from Moroccan Jews, from Kurdistani Jews, and each time I saw there was something that they had to offer. And I learned from that what are the ingredients, as it were, of the software for Davvenology. Now, where was the place where I was able to practice these things, the labs? Well, in my shuls, in Fall River, in New Bedford. And when I go back, the time in New Bedford, that's when I did lots of experimentation with a shul. That got me into trouble too, because I wanted people to experience silence like the Quakers, and offering prayers not from the siddur like the Baptists, and like the Christian Scientists giving testimonials and giving and saying thanks to God, and so on and so forth. But I hadn't prepared my poor congregation for that, and yet they participated. It was the board that couldn't handle it more than the rest of the people, who were more excited because it was a direct way for them to do it. When they hired me in New Bedford, they asked me whether I would conduct services in English also. Ha! English, I speak it the best, you know. I can do like the rest of the guys. And so I started to do this fake Episcopalian accent. Thou hast exalted my power like that of a wild ox, was my line in the responsive reading. And it didn't work for me. Otherwise, besides, I used to daven beforehand, so I should fulfill my obligation to God, and then I led the services. So obviously, I wasn't communicating with God at that time. I was leading the services. So I needed to do something else. And I had read in the teachings of Reb Elimelech of Lizensk that if you do something for 40 days, if you want to start a new habit, do it for 40 days uninterrupted, and then you will see how this becomes habituated for you. Well, I took to what was then the Birnbaum Siddur, the only decent translation that was available at the time. It had fewer vouchsafes and bestows in there than Adler and the translations that came from England. And so after a while I was going, blessed art thou, O Lord, who healest the sick of thy people Israel. So I was davening along. Even the blessings that I made over food, I would make them in English. And so it was obvious that melody that I was used to for the davening, that would open my heart, would come in even with the English. And that was a remarkable breakthrough. And later on, when I once led a service at Starlight, Pennsylvania, where all the Hillel delegates had come, and a slichot, and I used the nusach, the melodic lines of slichot, in English, and the people joined me, and they were moved by that. And on the other hand, there were some people who felt sort of ill at ease. English should be recited and not chanted, but they were wrong. On the other hand, you can't just do it like you want to do it. One of the rabbis tried to do it in his congregation. He said it fell flat. I asked him if he had done it at home for himself beforehand, and he said no. So I said, you by the time you get up there in the bima, you telegraph to the people how ill at ease you are with this thing, and it can't work for them either. But if you had tried this on your own, you would have gotten into it. So that was an important thing about Davvenology. Then learning from Howard Thurman was a remarkable thing, because Howard, the dean of the chapel at Boston University, and elsewhere I described it in greater detail how I met him, conducted a class with labs. And there he showed us how to use the liturgical material in such a way that it becomes experiential. And I'm grateful to him for this forever. So, then I moved to Winnipeg. And in Winnipeg, being Hillel director, I was able to do a number of these things. Write that little booklet, the first step, translate some things into English so people could daven along. We held retreats, and they were wonderful, and we held silent retreats, and more the things that I gotten out of Hasidism and our tradition found themselves in such a way that you could even codify, how would I say, a process. And so the theory behind this process is, for me, Davvenology. When I got the invitation to conduct high holiday services for Essel in San Francisco, that was a delight. So I prepared a machzor translation for the high holiday services and some tapes that I would play at various times. I had an orchestral version of ta 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 ta, so people were able to sing along when it came. It happened to be in 1973, which was the time of the Yom Kippur War, that this happened. And the people who came to that service, about 200 of Berkeley's finest with their meditation pillows, their little altars and everything else, then decided that they wanted to do more. And so the next year we did it at Glide Memorial Church with the Sufi choir singing, which was an experience that warms my heart to this day. And out of that grew the Aquarian Minyan, and I had many opportunities to come and teach these things that deal with Davvenology there. Then, of course, in 1968, when I took my sabbatical from University of Manitoba, and I was in Boston at Brandeis doing postdoctoral work, it was the year that the Chavurah was founded. And being in the faculty of the Chavurah for the first year, I had an opportunity of leading services and doing wonderful things as we sat on cushions on the floor and danced. And at the beginning of each season, we played the Vivaldi piece as part of Sukkot Zimra. And it was a wonderful time in which we learned things. By the way, that was also a time in which strobes were hot. And I would travel from time to time to different places with a service that was all on tape that could be danced through from the beginning of Lechuna Ranana all the way to Aleinu and the final Kaddish. There was a cantor who led a group of kids, the nifty Levites, in music, and I'm trying to remember his name. It doesn't come to me right now. Lawrence is his first name. Smoliver, right, Cantor Smoliver. And so then putting together Arba Kolot, and so there was a whole service that could be danced out to a strobe, which once we did in a Catholic retreat house, shocked the nuns, and then they told me about a priest who was doing the same kind of thing, and I went to his mass on Sunday afternoon. Wonderful. So these were the things that we tried at that time at the Chavurah also, and the Beatles were there. And sometimes before the davening we'd sing, "I'll Get High" with a little help from my friends, and it created a wonderful spirit. Moving to Philadelphia, first there were the Minyanim at the Germantown Jewish Center, and then those on Emlyn Street, which was my home and had a Beit HaMidrash in there. And there we were able to pioneer a whole bunch of things that were important. Also in 1975, Reb Arthur called together a group in May to celebrate the 10th yahrzeit of Martin Buber. And at that time, instead of giving a paper, I ran a workshop on I-Thouing, from which there came a lot of material that later on was used in the dyadic davening that we have practiced since that time. Also, working with USY, the conservative youth movement, with NIFTY, the Reform Youth Movement, and being a visitor at Camps Ramah and the Union Institutes, and two summers in Camps Ramah, where I served as religious environmentalist. That was the title of it. That's when we did the talitot that the kids made for themselves, and the scriptorium, that in the talisarium there was the sewing machine and the serger, and all the remnants that I'd gotten from manufacturers and tzitzis that the kids could turn. And in another place we had a scriptorium where people wrote their own mezuzahs on 3x5s and then went to the wood shop and made for themselves mezuzah covers. A lot of stuff that happened in these years came into the Jewish catalog at the end, and some of the students who studied with me, uh, which were the Strassfelds and Richard Siegel, were students in the course in Psychology of Religion that I gave at Brandeis University, and some of their work was the beginning of the Jewish catalog. So that's just the history of how things came, and then, of course, things continued at the Fellowship House farm work that we did with our wisdom school, and in Aleph, different kalot, and so on and so forth. So this is the history. It brings it up to date right now when I'm in Boulder and talking to you about the past. Now, what was it, if I ask myself the question, what was it that I wanted to really be clear about? And it's this. When Davvenon worked for me, what was it that happened when Davvenon worked for me? How would I define that it worked for me? Then the question was, what happened when it didn't work for me? What were the conditions? What was my attitude? What was my energy level at that time? So all these things go into thinking about that. I wanted to find out what the obstacles were. Their inner obstacles, their outer obstacles. Dealing with the outer obstacles is always easier because you can turn off the telephone and you can do all kinds of things of that sort. With the inner obstacles is a little bit harder. And one of the things that I discovered that during the weekdays, I always like to have a pad and a pencil around because there are all kinds of thoughts that are the very important things that I have to do, and they're very pressing, that come to me in the middle of davening. When the pressure is on, they don't intrude. But when the pressure is gone and I'm trying to daven, all of a sudden, whoom, it starts coming up. Now, at first I used to try and fight it. I don't want to think about it, though. But the voice inside of me said, you never want to think about it. you better do something about it. Anyway, I decided to write these things down as they come. And then I was able to bring my mind right back to where I was. Somehow, the manager inside of me, my ego manager, satisfied that I'm going to do something about it because I made notes. Then there was a question of timing. When was the best time? That's when I found out the richness. You know, I wasn't checking it in books at that point. I was trying to empirically find out what does it for me. And I found out that being up at dawn and watching the sunrise, I didn't have to push any words. They arrived on their own. When you see the first rays of the sun coming over the horizon, the words Yotzer, O, Vore, Chosher, Ose, Shalom, Vore, Takol, Yotzer, Hamerot, all this comes, and you have a sense of everything in nature waking up and singing the song of Psuke de Zimra, the heavens, the earth, the sun, the moon, the stars, the trees, the big animals, the little animals, the whales, the guppies, everybody is doing hallelujah. So I had the feeling that dawn was important time, and that dusk was important time. To begin the dusk time with a mincha, to end it with a ma'ariv, was sort of a very real thing. And the 20 minutes in between were to relish the confluence of daytime and nighttime consciousness. That double consciousness is like a neshama yetera that you get on Shabbos. So I found this was best possible time. Then I asked myself, what's the preparation? And obviously there are the official preparations. You go to the bathroom beforehand and you make sure that the body will not have any claims on you then. But then the other preparations are to, well, let me go and check back. When I was in Fall River, I served as a shochet, and that was the morning work. In the afternoon, I had to teach the kids in Hebrew school. So you can imagine if I come from killing chickens to teaching kids, it's not the easiest way. So I had to make a transition. So I had some records for dancing. And before I went to the class, I would turn on that record, that was an old 78, and I would dance that record out so that I could let go of the shochet and invite the teacher. So there is something about um, clearing things. It's almost like deleting certain files that are in residence, um, that are in a memory, resident memory, to clear them out because now you're going to do something else. So you don't have any conflict there. Then there was the set and the setting. And there was a period when I was very much into every bit of symbol. And I wanted to have in front of my Aron Kodesh a real living Ner Tamid, none of the electric stuff. So I experimented in those days with oil lamps and so on and so forth, so that it should be the real thing. Incense, for instance, and what that would help. So that had to do with setting. And then with set, am I coming in a kvetchy way, or am I coming in a joyful way to God? I remember still to this day, I'm in the middle of daven in the yeshiva. Oh, they're making this terrible face. And my mashpia, Rabbi Jacobson, the prayer coach, the one who taught us Chassidus, comes down in my ribs and says, "Have you tried already with a smile?" And that sort of flipped me around. It was like a Zen thing, and when I started to smile, it was so wonderful because I was able to bring a gift of that to God rather than coming complaining. There's enough kvetch as it is. It was very helpful to experience that. So that's part of the set. And what I concluded from this was that I wanted to see which ingredient had to be done first and which came later. And that's so wonderful that when I found in our Sidurim that the Birchot HaShachar, the blessings you say over the body, are the first thing, and they're in the world of action. And then the Psuke de Zimra, what you recite as joyful psalms, that's the second level. And recognizing that there was a third level in which the mind was involved, and that was for the Shema and its blessings. And the fourth level was the Amidah. And then it made it clear that we begin with the Hey on the bottom, and then go to the Vav, and then go to the upper Hey, and then go to the Yud, and then go even to the top of the Yud, and then come slowly down. So that whatever we have gained on the way up is then gently brought down. Well, that was one of the things I learned. I started to check out, are we the only ones who do it this way? And then I saw that the Mass, the Roman Catholic Mass, I'm not talking about it how it's today, it's very truncated today, but the classical Mass, over which most composers made Kyries, Glorias, and so on and so forth, Sanctus, that had a rise, and then it would go a steep descent. And just like ours had this rise and a steep descent after the Amidah. And I realized that from a physiological point of view, that's very much like the curve of male sexuality, and that it might have also been worthwhile to be able to have a gentler descent to come. And so I learned from that not to hang up the telephone too fast after the davening, but to really enjoy and relish and take in. And I learned that is what makes the prayer transformative. We can have experiences on the way up, but if we don't get impregnated by them, notice I'm using this feminine metaphor at this point, then we can't bring it down and it won't bear fruit. So, the early attempts at teaching was to learn something about body stance. And here I realized how terrible the pews were, and how people held the books when they sat in the pews as if they were reading nice at home, which meant I want some nice entertainment or information. But then you look at the siddur, it's the same old siddur you had the week before, and you've already read the introduction 5 times, and who the contributors were in the back 7 times. And you're bored by it, partly because you sit this way. But when you sit like this, and you sit forward, and you look in the book only as I look right now for an aide de memoire, it reminds me of what I want to do next. It keeps me in order. But it is the talking, it is the sharing that I want to do. Then I can say week after week, I can say the same thing, and it's fresh again. And it came to me the following way, that if I say to my beloved, I love you, and she were to say back to me, but you told me that yesterday, tell me something new, that would be a silly response, because I'm not saying it because I want to give information, but every time I feel that feeling moving in my heart, I want to say it that way. So it is a communicator of feeling that comes with the words and not of information. So body stance was important. Movement was important. The first time I had to do a thing with some nifty kids that were high school and early college kids in a Reform temple. And they wanted to find out about mysticism. And I asked myself, what kind of practice can I give them that would entrain them enough to be able to get a sense of body and continuity of mind. So I explained the thing about kadosh, you have a feeling of holiness in the heart. Happens at moments you're overcome, a sunrise, a sunset, a birth, a death. And then there is sacred as you understand it, so like your head. And then there is sacred as it goes. If sacred was only what I understood, it wouldn't be sacred at all. And then bringing it together, Yad Tzevaot, the Lord of hosts, and I become the host, inviting God to take up residence in me. And then I sweep around, say the whole world is filled with God's glory. And we chanted it, Kadosh, 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 Yad Tzevaot, Melo, Kol Haaretz Kevodo. And I would do it with them for about 20 minutes. And it was, and then I asked them, what did it mean to you? And after a while, you know, they had gotten past the first flip of boredom to the place that they felt something, and that body, mind, and soul in movement collaborated. Also, nigunim. Oh, it's, you know, most of the music that was coming was sort of yeshiva rock. Da da ba ba do 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 da 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 dum dum da dum dum da da little dum. So I had the feeling that where does it show that people did the kind of nigunim we did in Chabad? So I took some of the Chabad nigunim and taught it to the people, but I found that they didn't have the conscious content that was necessary. So I wrote some words to them, like, for the sake of my soul, I search for a goal, and I find none other than you. Oh Lord, taking these nigunim and giving people what the conscious content of that could be. And that was very important, because when people then learned that if they would sing a nigun like this beforehand, that it would enhance their set, their internal set. Nusach. Da 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 da. Come on, chant with me. Da 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 dum bum da 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 dum bum da 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 da. Well, tell me, didn't you feel you're moving into Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? Those people who have learned Nusach realize that the best attunement that they can have to a particular yontif is through the melodies of that yontif. And so the melody for the four questions on Pesach, the Dai Dayenu, brings back almost the taste of matzah in your mouth and of the wine. So everything that comes with that melody the melody was a container in which I could store enthusiasms that I had in the past so that they could come back to me and enrich me. And then it was also very important, so you have the nusach for every prayer. And I have this videotape in which the Rebbes are doing davening. That videotape of the various nuschaot, and it pointed to me that in the controversy between Buber and Gershon Scholem, when they were talking what's important about Hasidic masters, and Scholem would say his teachings, and Buber would say the stories, and I would say not enough. You also need to know how they davened, and you need to know their melodies, and you can tune in such a remarkable way if you know that style, because the style is part of the God field. It's part of the morphogenetic field that we have built over ages. And the translations had to be such. Thou hast exalted my head like that of a wild ox, my horns like that of a wild ox. Didn't make much sense. So we had to find a way of translating it. And then there was the issue of gender equality and so on. So if you have an opportunity to take a look in my Hashir ve'Hashevach, you have there the translations that I made for Estel in San Francisco, in which we would be able to daven with the high holiday melody and the words in such a way that some people could chant them in Hebrew at the same time we were doing this in English. That I learned from Franz Rosenzweig. I didn't meet Franz Rosenzweig in this style, but in this lifetime. But when he and his wife first got married and they were on their honeymoon, he realized that she couldn't read the Hebrew words with him. So he did a translation of the Tischdank, the thank you at the table, for her in German, which had the same rhythm and phrasing, so that you could have Hebrew and German together. That was a great teaching, that simultaneity, which led me later on to create that tape, Davenin with Rabbi Zalman, in which you have the Hebrew for one ear and the English for the other, so that there would be that simultaneity. So the right kind of translations that don't put you into the wrong metaphors was always important. Then, affirmations. I realized that making affirmations was something that people did, how would I put it, naturally. Coming into the shul, and they were reciting Vani v'rov chazdecha avo betecha ishtacha v'elhecha al kodshecha b'yiratecha, and I, as I enter your house and bow down to you, and so on and so forth, and people would wash their hands beforehand. That was so much taken for granted. So they affirmed that. Nowadays, we have to find verbal affirmations so that people could really steer their consciousness, saying, I am now walking into the shul. We walk into the shul so much like into a clubhouse today. And the situation is that first you sit down and you chat with the people, and then the rabbi has to stare you down for a little bit, clear his throat, until finally it gets quiet enough for them to start the service. Now, can you imagine how much different it is, and we have done it from time to time like that you walk into the shul and you sit in silence, and as people come in, the ushers point to them and say, and they come in, and instead of feeling that you are being observed by people and so on and so forth, you really sit down. You know that for the next 5 minutes, nothing else is going to happen except it's going to be silent there. So you begin to meet your own values and consult your values again, and you get into a different state of mind. So that's important. And then there are the affirmations to be made about brachas, and Marcia Falk's work on the brachot on the blessings with so much affirmations. We give thanks to the source of life and so on. Now, concentration and imagination was very important because the mind usually doesn't want to stay on one track. It's too much interested in everything else that might happen. So learning concentration was important. But before you could even do concentration, there was something I learned from Professor Eugene Gendlin, where he points out that you have, if you want your psychotherapy to work well, you have to first focus in on your body and ask the body, what's the felt sense that you have, and begin from there. And I found that that was important because it was consulting with what's lying down here? What is, what is the peckle that I'm carrying on my shoulders, and can I give it over to God? And then to figure out what that is, and then to say it and to state it in a way and saying, Rabbi Shalom, I want to daven right now, but I want you to know I have concerns for so and so and so and so. Please, you mind them for a while I do the davening. It helps because you can get there. That has to do with concentration. And the next one has to do with the remarkable thing of using one's imagination. The Zohar puts it so beautifully. How is God known? How is her husband known? Her husband is known in the gates. The Zohar translates, what's the gate? The imagination. Lefumah de Mishayer Bilibeh. As you open your heart, as you imagine in your heart, that's how big it can be. And stretching the imagination of the heart, so it's become larger, became important. I want to say more about imagination. There was a French writer, and his name escapes me at this moment. He wrote about Henri Corbin was his name, and he wrote on the imagination in Ibn al-Arabi. What he points out there is that there is a whole realm that is a reality of its own. No one has better described the reality of the world of Yetzirah as Corbin has. And so it's really clear that warm, felt imagination filling in sort of with Technicolor and with the feelies and with all that where one is, places you in a situation. Even if I want to follow King David and see how did he feel when he had to play that he was crazy so that he could escape the Philistine king, and when finally he was safe and there poured out of him the thankfulness. So the more I can be with him in my imagination, the more I can experience what the psalm that he has said. So imagination is very vital here. There is so much more that we need to learn and to practice. And Baruch Hashem, among the people in Aleph, there are many, many who have learned about all kinds of phases in Davvenology. And I just want to repeat to you, if you want to learn Davening, you can't learn it from a book, and not even from a videotape. You got to learn it from a davener. Because when you stand in the proximity of someone who's actually davening, your body takes on like that stance. And it gets into a place where there's a coalescing. There's a felt sense that says, you got it. This is the way it's right. That felt sense is so beautifully described by Eugene Gendlin when he says, you forgot something at home, but you forgot that you forgot it. But it troubles you, it nudges you. What was it that I forgot? Was it this? And something comes up and you say, no, it wasn't this. Was it that? Something comes up, it wasn't that. Finally you say, it was that. And you have a feeling this was the thing. This was the thing. So the body settles in around that. And that's very much the feeling that you get when you stand next to a davener and it feels right, you know. This is how children learn, mimicking their parents. Even chimpanzees learn from one another that way. There is something that comes when those vibes get translated. Next, breath. I have found that if I could do like Muslims do it so beautifully when they read Quran, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, and each time taking the time for the breath. And I find that we always have the chappers, so that by the time you barely finish with in a responsive reading or in a chanting, one line and the other people start jumping in right away, instead of letting that just almost like the echo go down before you start the next one and with a breath. And that helps. And there are all kinds of breath things that we learn, how to coordinate the yud with no breath in the lungs, and the hey, filling the lungs like a hay, and then holding the breath and sending it out in all the 6 directions of the body, the vav, and the exhalation, the other hey, and doing 18 yud hey vav hey breaths as you shift from one part of daven into the other, where you want to bring your mind and being back. If it has departed from that, that's a good way to do it. Then I wanted to show people the simultaneity of all that, what you have to do all at the same time. So in my paradigm shift, there's a symphonic score for the Amidah that shows you just like a conductor looking at all the instruments, so you could see the body, what the body does, what the body feels, and what the mind feels, and so on and so forth. Because as I mentioned to you before, the thing about why is it that the 4 worlds thing is so strong? It's the 4 yogas, and it is the 4 levels in Sufism and Islam, and it's the 4 ways in which Jung talks about sensation, feeling, reason, and intuition. Lots of people, Native Americans, have their own way of having the circle, the sacred circle that way, with the 4 parts of it. So what is it that is the 4Z in us? And it became clear to me that as I was studying some brain physiology, that we have the reptilian brain, so corresponding to the Asiya thing, and the limbic brain corresponding to the Yetzira, and the cortex to Bria, and that which is in the prefrontal lobes and the unformatted part of the brain. That's where intuition comes in, and that's why it's not verbal, and feeling isn't verbal. Action and reason are both easily verbalizable, but the other ones are not. So davening brings all this stuff together, and I wanted to show if we could first daven with one instrument, as it were, then you daven with 2 instruments, then you daven with 3 instruments. Before long, you have the symphonic thing. And if you could it would pay to spend time on that with the first blessings of the Amidah, and then you will see how that will transfer to all kinds of other things in davening. Practice sessions and retreats became really very important, because people, until you do it wrong, you don't know how to do it right. We were biologically programmed, Bucky Fuller pointed out, to learn from our mistakes. And if people want to give you information and you never had a chance to mistake, then you can't take it right either afterwards. The precision comes from having made a mistake and learned afterwards. So having occasion to daven with other people and to have labs and not to be ashamed. I don't know why do rabbis expect people in their congregations to come in and to know already what to do in a congregation if they never had a rehearsal. I used to take the time when I was leading congregations on the high holidays. Slichot time was for me 2 hours before we started the Slichot service itself was a time to do rehearsal, so that when time came for the high holidays, people knew how to respond. There's so much more. There's so much more to be said. Um, and let me just say, this is the beginning for you. What is necessary to do more? One of the things I pioneered in was the thing of socialized meditation. It's really necessary to work with other people in such a way that the inner process becomes a shared process. A, you don't get bored. B, you have a vital, living person with you. C, you can also act on your belief that each person has God within themselves. So if you want to have the easiest way to talk to God, it's harder to talk to God within your own self than to talk to God in the self of another, whom we ask for a moment to become transparent and let you through. So learn more about this kind of shared davening and meditation. Three more items I want to mention right now. You will have experiences in davening, and they will be fleeting. They won't stay with you unless you bring him down and take time to bring him down afterwards. But even that necessitates that you have the right kind of concepts in your mind. So study whatever you can of Davvenology and of Hasidus and Kabbalah so that your mind can wrap itself around what your soul knows. Then you will also see that in the battle that you have between your ought and your is, that much more of your ought would be installed in your is, in your practice. The values will become real in your practice because davening is going to help that too. And then comes the business of blessing and generosity, compassion for everyone. I think even if you want to give somebody some reproof, you might also begin with the compassion. When I first met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the first thing that I said to him, I realized how much you would want to be involved in your depth and in your meditation. And here you have to travel around the world, and you carry the destiny of your people on your shoulders. And so I just want you to know that I feel with you. His eyes filled with tears, and so did mine, because it was a recognition of that. The rest of the dialogue was so much easier because that had taken place. So keep in mind that you want to give blessings to yourself and you want to give blessings to other people. And when you begin with that compassion, the blessing is going to come. I want to give you a blessing. There's so much more in Davvenology. I just feel that I've barely said hello to the topic, and I've also just done a laundry list of it. I wish for you to talk to each other, to create circles of spiritual intimacy and practice so that you might, when it comes to actual davening, really have learned how to do that. So, kol tuv, many brachas to you, and ivdu et Hashem b'simcha. Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha. Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha. Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha. Bo lefanav birnana.